Hello, everyone. I'm Donovan Irvin, a former staff member at Social Venture Partners. I left staff to pursue an MBA and Master of Environmental Management at Yale because I want to use the tools of business and capital flow to create systemic solutions to social and environmental challenges. So it's truly my honor to introduce the next program, Challenging the Status Quo to Create Systems Change. The topic is relevant and timely. We must interrogate our foundational assumptions. We must challenge our sense of normal if we truly want to build a society with healthier ecological and social systems. But even more important than the discussion topic are the people who are actually discussing it. People leading the work on a local, regional, and national level. People who are putting in the sweat equity. And we certainly have an amazing set of leaders who fit that bill today. We'll start with a fireside-style keynote conversation between Angela Glover Blackwell and Susan Hoff. Please see their full bios on the bigBANG website, but a few notes about these speakers. Angela Glover Blackwell is a founder in residence at PolicyLink, the organization she started in 1999 to advance racial and economic equity for all. Under Ms. Glover Blackwell's leadership, PolicyLink gained national prominence in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, and infrastructure. Ms. Glover Blackwell is an inspiring truth teller and thought leader. Her Radical Imagination podcast debuted in September 2019, introducing listeners to a world of creative, progressive thinkers whose vision is challenging the status quo to create the change we need. Most recently, in June of this year, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, she also co-authored an opinion piece in the New York Times entitled, "Banks Should Face History and Pay Reparations," an important, poignant analysis on the intersection of power, capital, race, and history. Every time I hear Ms. Glover Blackwell speak, I feel at once comforted and challenged. And it's an honor to have her join bigBANG as a keynote speaker. This part of the conversation will be moderated by Susan Hoff, who serves as Chief Impact Strategy and Operations Officer for the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. She's a highly sought after trainer and public speaker and has developed curricula and educational publications for children and adults, and is an accomplished fund developer. I got to know Susan through my work at SVP, and I've seen personally how her thoughtful, kind, and strong leadership has changed Dallas for the better. We'll end our time with a conversation with Andrea Glispie from United Way Metropolitan Dallas. Andrea will discuss her work with the Jobs and Opportunity Project that she's been leading locally in partnership with PolicyLink. Thank you to all the speakers for sharing your wisdom and experiences. And more importantly, thank you for all of your hard work. And with that, I'll pass it to Susan.
Thank you, Donovan. I cannot think of anyone I would rather be introduced by. I am just so proud of you and your leadership and the amazing work that you have done, but also I know the work that you will do for many, many years to come. You give me tremendous hope for our world. I also could not be more honored than to be able to have a conversation with you, Angela. This is honestly a little bit of a dream come true for me. So thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us. And then finally, I just want to say how proud I am of Andrea Glispie. She has been on the United Way team for several years, and she, just like Donovan, is one of those amazing, audacious, bold young leaders who I believe are going to change the world. So thank you all for being here with us today. So I'm going to start, Angela, with just a couple of questions, as we said, and we'll bat this back and forth, and then I will turn it over to you to really lead us through the wisdom that you bring and vast experience. So the first question I have is, there's this pervasive kind of perception that an intentional focus on one group deprives others. You addressed it in your 2017 Stanford Review of Social Innovation article called The Curb Cut Effect. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Donovan, for the introduction. And it is my pleasure to be part of this conversation. It is such an important time to explore exactly the issue that you have raised, because we're leaning in as a society trying to figure out how to really put our muscle to a commitment to make sure that those who have been disproportionately long-term left behind are able to participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. And at the same time, there is hesitation. People think that, if we put all of our resources there, what about the others? What about people who have been receiving resources? Are they going to have to give something up? First of all, we shouldn't be having that conversation. We ought to think about the moral imperative to be fully inclusive, to make sure that people who have suffered historically are not continually placed at a disadvantage. But we have to have the conversation whether we should or should not, because the moral imperative does not always control. And in this instance, we are really quite fortunate as a nation that if we invest in those who have been most marginalized, targeted, discriminated against, the entire society will benefit. I think of it as the notion that equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential is the superior growth model for the nation. Equity is the superior growth model. If we get equity right, we get so much right. I've been talking about that for a while, and sometimes I have the impression that people don't grasp what it is I'm saying, don't want to hear it, push back on it. And so I struggle to find a more inviting way to be able to make that same point. And one day it dawned on me that the curb cut in the sidewalk is the classic example of the point that I have been trying to make. Those cutouts in the sidewalk are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs, who, no matter how much progress they were making in terms of gaining rights, did not have the ability to fully experience and participate in community life if they couldn't get around. And so we got those curb cuts in the sidewalk because of people in wheelchairs really stepping up for themselves. But we all benefit from those curb cuts. How many times have you been pushing a stroller and been so glad you didn't have to pick that contraption up? How many times have workers had their burden eased, whether they were pulling wagons or pushing carts? Or like me, trying to catch a bus or a train with a traveling and not having to break your pace pulling one of those rollies because you could keep moving smoothly through the curb cut. The curb cuts suggest that if we solve problems with nuance and specificity for those who are most marginalized, vulnerable, targeted, discriminated against, we solve problems for everybody. Once you know what you're looking for, you can see it every place. The example that I like to use, because we all are familiar with it, is not smoking in public places. It saved millions of lives. But how did it start? It started with flight attendants on airplanes who, no matter how hard the industry tried to make sure that passengers might be protected from smoke by having a no smoking section, it did nothing for the flight attendants. Once they joined with Ralph Nader, that famous consumer advocate, and they were able to get smoking banned on airplanes, that began a movement to ban smoking in public places, solving problems with nuance and specificity for some and reaching everybody. So you find that example every place, and you can apply it to right now. If we make sure that low-income people of color have access to high-quality education, we begin to improve our entire educational system, and that benefits everyone. If we make sure that people who are most vulnerable to disease and bad outcomes, as we're experiencing right now with COVID and mortality and morbidity associated with it, concentrated in communities of color, if we can solve it there, the whole society will benefit. It is just so clear that equity is not a zero-sum game. You solve problems for the most targeted, marginalized, and vulnerable, and everybody benefits.
Thank you so much. And you're right. You know, it is, you're right. We shouldn't have to have this conversation, but thank you so much for putting it in a way that is easy for anyone to grasp, I think, in a way that feels like, yeah, we could all figure that out. So thank you. Thank you. And I would encourage everybody on the line, if you've not read the article, it is a tremendous piece of work. So thank you, as is the entire body of Angela's work. So my second question, you know, I've spent my entire career in social services and nonprofit arena, and particularly working oftentimes with children and families practitioner and leader. And so there's, my quandary here is that much of the work that we do in the social service arena really feels like it is treating symptoms. So if I think about a groundwater approach, you think about if you see a lake and you've got one dead fish in there, the idea would be, well, I'd look at that fish and see what happened to that fish. If I see a lake where half the fish are dead, I probably ought to be looking at the lake. If I see a collection of lakes, like 5 or 10 of them, and half the fish in all of those lakes are dead, I ought to be thinking about the groundwater, not trying to fix the half the fish or help half the fish that are still able to survive. So that's the quandary I think about. Do we do, again, as I go back to so much of our work in the social service arena is really up there on the top of the lake. How do we balance the need to focus very, very strongly on systems change, but also treating those that are having challenges right now? And how do you balance that? And how do you make sure we're not sacrificing one for the other?
It's a good question and not easy to respond to. First, because we always think of ourselves as operating in an atmosphere of scarcity where we can't do everything. The one thing I try to encourage people to hold in their minds is the United States of America is not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one. And we have put philanthropy in the position of trying to address issues that our government could address if it had more resources, whether you're talking about city, county, state, or federal. Therefore, we have to think in multiple ways. We have to think about how to be able to support the advocacy that is needed to make sure that government is doing its part. We also, as we are trying to get government to step in and make sure that we don't have homelessness and hungry children and educational systems that don't have even books. Too often philanthropy is buying books for the school. Does that make any sense in a country with this wealth? No, it doesn't. But if that is the case, I think there's definitely a role for investing in those things that are direct service. Not only is it the humane thing to do, but it is a way to develop the models that often inform policy. Think about the Harlem Children's Zone in New York City, where they have worked in ways that have been just tremendous to create a model, which really is a service model of how do you do wraparound services, how do you have educational systems that really work, how do you make sure you support young people to be ready to go to college. But that service model has informed government policy in terms of what it is that we really need to do to go forward. And so I think that we have to have a mindset of doing it all. Let me start with advocacy. Those of us who see that there is a systems problem need to be asking, what's the role of government? What's the role of civil society? What's the role of the business sector? And really get clear about things that government ought to be taking care of, because we all care about all of the people in the country. And there are some things that we just have to provide. Fund advocacy and don't be afraid to do so. At the same time, we have to live in reality. There are needs that are service needs that should be met. So we have to figure out a way to be able to do that. But let's do that in a way that allows us to be able to understand what needs to change on the policy front, fund the policy development work, use models, and then pay for the ability to translate learnings from a model into policy, and make sure that we are all analyzing the system and trying to align the system with our values. So one of the problems in the United States right now is that our values and our systems are misaligned, and we need to actually be using philanthropy to figure out, what do we want to do? What are the best ways to do it? Let's have a voice that really says, let's move in this direction and build the support.
Radical philanthropy. That sounds like a new catchword. So, talking to you, and you're an optimist. And I think I heard you say in one of your, at one time or another, that it might be genetic with you, that you just, that's the way you are, as well as the way you were raised. But I've also heard you say that, just like for most of us, these last now almost 8 months have been a real mixed bag of emotions, incredible sadness about the challenges that too many people are facing, both in health and in and in our economy. The incredible challenges, I think, particularly, as you've said, for young people who are going to face such long-term obstacles in these coming years, but also your tremendous hope. When you see growing public awareness and willingness to address issues about race, and also, excited and energized by the audacity, I think you said, of young people to make a radical difference. So, there are many things that have been going on. And I think, when I think about young people, I look at Donovan, I look at Andrea, I look at others. Oftentimes, young people are who lead change. So that's not terribly different, although perhaps they're more at the table these days. But what's different than things were 50 years ago now that we need to take advantage of, and that is making you even more optimistic than your DNA dictates?
Thank you, Susan. And I do think that I am generally optimistic, but as an optimistic person, I have not seen a moment that is more pregnant with the possibility of being able to fulfill the promise of the nation and the desires of so many people within it to be able to fully participate and reach their potential. What I am seeing is absolutely grounded in reality and not just hope. Because I was a child during the civil rights movement. That's when I was a child and a teenager. And I remember my parents' excitement about what was happening and my own curiosity about what was happening, in this sense that I never had any doubt of my humanity, never had any doubt about the abilities that my community had and the assets that we could bring. And so while I appreciated the final passage of civil rights legislation, getting rid of legal segregation, it just seemed like the logical step, and that nobody was giving me anything, but the nation was probably just living up to what it ought to do. And then I came out of college into the Black Power movement, which was a time in which there was excitement among young people to embrace Blackness, to be so proud of being Black, and to move the conversation. Yes, we need to have rights, but we also need to step into our power and step into our leadership role around the economy and democracy. Those movements, even though they were all important, both important, they had not fully moved to a point in which the nation was absolutely dependent on becoming anti-racist. But that's where we are now, that the extraordinary young people who have led the Black Lives Matter movement have challenged the nation to understand that it is not enough just to say you're not racist. We have to be anti-racist, which means we have to move to understand the legacy and the history of the past, to work against it, and to create a society that really honors every individual and creates systems and pathways for people to be able to move forward. And it's centered in understanding the origin story of the nation. This was a nation that was founded on stolen land, genocide, human bondage, and slave labor. That is a horror history. And it was guided by a narrative that there was a hierarchy of human value, that some people were worth more than others. We are now putting that all on the table and having a conversation about understanding the depth of the Black-white paradigm, because Indigenous people were killed and isolated. Black and white people lived together in the horror of slavery, lived together in the horror of slavery. And the protocols and standards of oppression were developed in that context. And so the oppression that exists in society that impacts everybody, whether you're transgender, whether you're a woman, whether you're Latinx, whether you're Asian, whatever your status might be, that the standards of oppression grew out of that Black-white paradigm. And until we face it and fix it and consciously move beyond it, we will not get rid of a society that carries it within its DNA, this hierarchy of human value. We have got to jettison that. And that's what this movement is about. Who could not be hopeful at a moment when we're having this kind of honest conversation? I didn't just come to understand these things, but this is the moment in which I can talk about it and others are talking about it and people are leaning in to hear it and think about what does it mean for their actions going forward. I am hopeful. I don't know whether we get on the other side in a short period of time or a long period of time, but I think once you start down a path of honesty and commitment to something that is affirmative, to be anti-racist, to be fully inclusive, and understand that people of color are becoming the majority fast. By 2044, the majority of people in this country will be people of color. But by 2030, the majority of the young workforce will be of color. This year, it became a fact that the majority of those 18 and under are of color. The fate of the nation is dependent on those who have been left behind. The fate of the nation is dependent on getting this equity agenda right. It's a moral imperative. It's an economic imperative. It's a democratic imperative. That makes me hopeful.
Me too. And I think too, the investment that we see from the corporate community is real. The infusion of capital, both real money as well as, lending brand. And as you said, I mean, it's an economic imperative and it's different. Without negating all the work that happened over the last 50 years in terms of building the foundation. So I'm going to ask one last question, then I'm going to hand it off to you to continue. So, I was listening again at your 2018 PolicyLink Summit. You kind of foreshadowed, I think, the moment we are in now, and you described it as transformative solidarity. And you've talked quite a bit about that. But again, it's one, and you said, in which people can stop standing on the outside seeking respect, as you said, and in seeking respect and inclusion, and begin to own the place they live and lead that change with radical imagination. And so I will hand it to you to continue to talk about radical imagination. And thank you so much for joining us today. It has been quite an honor to visit with you. And I look forward to seeing the continued optimism of you that will drive change across our community. Thank you, Angela.
Susan, thank you. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. And thank you for asking me to continue to talk about radical imagination and what it means, particularly for the business sector. That we really are living in a time in which we're going to have to dig deep to be able to lift up a new North Star. A new North Star that envisions a country that we have never really had. We have talked about equality and we've talked about inclusion, but we have never built a country in which all could feel that they belong and have the opportunity to reach their full potential. We need to commit ourselves to doing that, but it's going to require a new North Star and a radical imagination in terms of how it is we're going to get there, designing the systems and the strategies, and everybody has a role to play. Civil society needs to be able to step in and be able to build community and make demands. Government needs to really understand that there is always a role for government in a society in which there is this partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and civil society. But business in particular has a role to play here. There is often a time in society when it's government that has to pull the private part of the society into a new place. Business really has to understand that for it to continue to thrive into the future, we have to really invest in the people who are going to be the future. And so this notion of becoming anti-racist also applies in the business sector. Anti-racist businesses, anti-racist business practices, anti-racist corporate leadership. And when we say that this is where we need to go there to unleash the talent that business is going to need to thrive, to be able to prepare and build the consumer so that the business is going to need to thrive, to be able to have the communities in which employers and workers really want to exist. It's going to require focusing in three ways. One, businesses have to focus internally. Their HR practices have to really be aligned with the desire to be more inclusive. They have to be aggressive about going out and recruiting people of color who can come into the business. But just bringing people in is not enough. You have to create a culture of belonging so everybody knows that they have a contribution to make, that they're valued in terms of being there, that some people don't feel that they're just guests in the business, but they're all part of it. You have to really do an audit and make sure that the places where you're recruiting, the way that you're bringing people in, don't automatically exclude, even if it is not the intention to exclude. You have to do that kind of audit. But it's also important that you think about how to be able to make sure with your practices, you're building the kind of society that we want. You have to pay living wages. Very often, the very people who we're concerned about, low-income people of color, are in business and they are the frontline workers. And they are low income because those frontline jobs don't pay enough. We need to pay living wages. But also think about the fact that the people that we want to bring a bright future are there within the companies in these frontline worker positions. We need to have advancement opportunities. We need to have educational opportunities. All of that is part of the internal working. We also need to have worker voice. The workers are the ones who understand the companies. They're the ones who understand the dangers. Think about COVID right now. It is the workers who understand how it is they need to be safe. They should be part of the planning within the business about how to create safety. Worker voice is so important. But the other thing that businesses do internally is they design products and services. And you need to make sure, if you want to be an anti-racist business, that you're looking at the products and services and you're making sure that you are not part of products that hold people back, that continue to create the extraordinary racial wealth gap that we have in this country. People who are white have 10 times the wealth of people who are Black. If you're a company that is doing predatory credit card lending, you need to stop that. So we need to look at the products and services and think about, are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? But also need to look at things like bias. Are you running a company that only delivers in certain zip codes? Can people only get food from your grocery store delivered in certain zip codes? What zip codes are being excluded? Think about how to design so that that bias is not there. Think about whether or not you're using facial recognition in a way that is placing people who are Black at a disadvantage. So the internal includes all of that, and it has to look at operations and supply. Are you unbundling contracts so that Black and Latinx companies and women-run companies can participate in the wealth that's being built? All of these things are internal. But also businesses exist in community, and we need to get back that relationship between business and community. And think about in the philanthropic arm, how to do what Susan and I were just talking about, not just fund services, but also fund advocacy, also fund policy development, also fund organizing, and find those organizations that have of color leadership that really gets it. People who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, they're understanding their challenges with great nuance. Those leaders need to have organizational infrastructure behind them so their leadership can really begin to be part of what is happening in their communities and leading in a different way. And then it is also important to think about what to do with the outsized influence that businesses have developed over the past 30 or 40 years. We have seen a steady erosion of people being able to control their democracy and it falling under the umbrella of business. That businesses have really built up quite an infrastructure to be able to lobby and change government regulations for their benefit. They may have started off to do this just to make sure that their businesses had more freedom, but what we have is a hugely outsized power for business to influence what happens with government, for business to influence who gets elected to public office. And so we need for business to step into this moment that is ripe with transformation to become a nation that will benefit us all, including business, to lean in with that muscle and begin to push policies that build this fully inclusive society. We need businesses to use that muscle to get universal health care. We need businesses to really make sure that our local communities have the kind of public education system that children need. We need for business to lean in and make sure that the things that we're trying to put in place that really create those steps and platforms and ladders that allow for all to participate and prosper are on their agenda when they think about how to lobby for a better society. Because the ecosystem of equity is the one that's going to allow business to be able to tap the full benefit of what is the nation. What could be more important in a global economy than to have a nation that is connected to the globe through kinship, through language, through custom? We want to be able to tap all of that to be able to bring in the creativity of people into business, to be able to use business to build the middle class that has been such a mark for this nation. The future of the nation is dependent on what happens to the people who are going to be that future. They are going to be disproportionately people of color as we move forward. And so we can see where our investment needs to go. But we can also see the benefit to business, the benefit to society, the benefit to humanity, the benefit to the world if we get it right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I think now we're going to turn it over to Andrea Glispie.
Thank you, Angela, again for your amazing vision of how we achieve how we achieve equity and a systematic change, and the role that we all play in the creation of that change, from businesses to philanthropy to improving and accessing the worker voice. Such tremendous words that you brought this with us today. And I have really the privilege of working with PolicyLink on a new project that United Way is leading, the Jobs and Opportunity Project. And I'd like to talk with you about that today and how we're advancing workforce equity in our community. The project examines indicators and drivers of workforce equity facing people of color in Dallas and Collin Counties. We also seek to advance actionable strategies to promote workforce equity and improve labor market outcomes for people of color. United Way has partnered with PolicyLink and also the National Fund for Workforce Solutions to do this work. JPMorgan Chase is funding this effort in Dallas and in 9 other cities, including places like Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, and Boston. The project will release a report on equity gaps facing people of color, drivers of these gaps, and solutions for closing equity gaps in January. To get this project off the ground, United Way has mobilized business, civic, education, nonprofit, and philanthropic and workforce stakeholders to help guide this effort. One of the first things that we did together was imagine, well, how does workforce equity look and feel? We came to the conclusion that workforce equity means that race, ethnicity, gender, and other demographic characteristics no longer predict one's success in the labor market. It also means that workers are economically resilient and have access to jobs that are safe, pay a living wage, offer benefits and career pathways, and opportunities for advancement. Disparities in compensation and employment are eliminated for all demographic groups and across all occupations and industries. The project really seeks to answer some central questions. How does systematic racism manifest itself in the labor market? Who has access to good jobs? What are racial equity implications for the future of work and the automation we know will take place and how they will change the jobs of the future? As a group, we had to go about a process for figuring out what types of data we wanted to examine that could be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and in some cases, nativity, to really help us make comparisons between how white workers are facing versus people of color in the labor market. First and foremost, our project is looking at who is in the labor market and what industries they are working in. We also wanted to know who's not working from a historical basis as well as a snapshot in time, and what is their educational level. We wanted to know what types of workers are making a living wage as a proxy of $15 an hour, and what the average wages of workers are by educational level. With the onset of COVID, we wanted to understand how it's impacted the labor market. And as we look to the future of our workforce, we wanted to look at what jobs will be growing and what jobs will be shrinking, and who will stand to benefit the most from job growth. We also wanted to know who is the future of our workforce, who will be our workforce of tomorrow, and ultimately who stands to benefit and be at the greatest disadvantage by trends in automation that we expect to be really about and embody the future of the workforce. We have some early data that has come in that help us answer some of these questions. And what we know is that people of color are already the majority of our Dallas and Collin County labor market, yet they're twice as likely to be economically insecure. We know that racial economic exclusion hampers our region's, Dallas and Collin County's economic growth. Racial gaps cost Dallas and Collin counties billions of dollars. And if we had greater racial equity, we can increase Latinx incomes by 2.5 times and double the incomes of Black workers. The data tells us that occupational segregation is pervasive. And what we mean by occupational segregation is that one racial or ethnic group is overrepresented in some occupational categories, while other racial and ethnic groups are underrepresented in others. For instance, white workers are overrepresented in professional categories, and workers of color are crowded in low-paying jobs. People of color also face systematic and structural barriers to opportunity, and educational attainment does not automatically erase those barriers. We'd like to think that educational is a great equalizer, but what we can see from the data is that, for instance, a white worker with no college degree still makes more than a Black and Latinx worker with an associate degree. Finally, COVID is posed to have has already had a great impact on our labor market, and is compounding pre-existing racial inequities and accelerating automation. What we can see from the labor market data is that demand for jobs that require little experience or education have recovered to the February baseline. But jobs that require more preparation, particularly jobs that require an associate or bachelor's degree, are still down by 30%. And when we look at automation, it's the Black and Latinx workers that will face disproportionate risk of automation, displacement, or losing jobs from automation versus white workers. So where do we go from here? Over the last several months, United Way has worked with its network of partners to explore what steps we need to take to achieve greater workforce equity and eliminate disparities in pay and employment for outcomes for workers of color. One of the first things, and Angela brought this up in her talk, is that we need to look at improving job quality of entry-level or frontline work where workers of color predominate, so that more of them are earning a living wage of $15 an hour or more. Another thing we have to do is confront occupational segregation by increasing the number of pre-apprenticeships and apprenticeships in industries where people of color are underrepresented. We know that occupational segregation is fueled by hiring bias and could be remedied with strategies that improve hiring, like skills-based hiring, where employers look beyond degrees and number of years worked and look at the skills that the job candidate is actually bringing to the table. The COVID pandemic has brought into the forefront of our minds not only the digital divide, but the lack of digital literacy skills that certain groups of workers have. And this could keep them from accessing the technology-enabled jobs of the future. But with greater investments in digital literacy, we can ensure that they have access to these jobs and are not displaced because of automation. We also need to isolate what workforce interventions work for people of color by disaggregating participant outcomes from education and workforce programs. And finally, we need to look at where to align workforce development programs with worker rights projects so that workers of color are not only building skills for job placement, but they're being placed in jobs that offer basic protections, like the proper job classification, and that these jobs offer opportunities for advancement. This is a roadmap that we can use to achieve greater workforce equity. It'll take all of us, employers, funders, and community-based organizations in working in unison to close gaps and ensure that we all, especially workers of color, have a share in our economic prosperity today and of the future. Thank you. And I think I'll hand it back to Susan.
Thank you again, Andrea, and thank you all. It was a wonderful conversation. And, you know, 2 words I'll leave us with: radical philanthropy. This is the time to be absolutely optimistic. And so thank you, as I said, Andrea, thank you particularly to Angela for sharing her time and her words of wisdom with us. And I will hand it back to our bigBANG hosts. Thank you.